We welcome you all to TIPS, those who are in the room, welcome, and those who are online as well. Thank you for attending our development dialogue on a happy Friday. There's always questions about having events on Fridays. It's still a day, it's still a working day, guys. Come. Okay, but this is a very special one for us, for the Just Transition Labour Centre, as well as for TIPS. We are yet again dealing with Sasol, and the team who will be presenting today have done quite a lot of work on Sasol before. This time around with our work, it's a bit more focused on labour and communities and how the just transition is going to affect them regarding Sasol and the future of Sasol, whether happy or sad. And you'll see from the presentation and the wonderful report that's been written, which is quite incredible, quite long, quite detailed, and we are looking forward to digest it further. And the development dialogue today is our first sort of public foray into what the report is itself saying, with its specific focus for us. So we're going to move today through a very simple agenda. Just for the team, so you guys know, as I told you about how we present and where we do, we've got a little camera right over there, and that's where you can look into, and it does that. Okay. We've got our team from Employment Relations Exchange, which has both done the reports before for TIPS and has done the one for us at the Just Transition Labour Centre. We've got Dr. Rod Crompton, Dr. Bruce Young, Noreen Khan, and Tristan Hahn, who will all come and present for us their report. And we're going to follow that up afterwards by having a discussant who will help us digest it and tease out a few of the implications that we want to bring out, that are maybe not as technical, but are speaking to sort of the implications faced by labour, both employed at Sasol, both in the working class movement and the communities who are affected by what may be occurring at Sasol in the future. And basically some questions are thrown up in the report, and some important ones we need to find a way to answer. And we'll proceed like that through our discussants, who's Andile Zulu, who's from AIDC in Cape Town, so he'll join us online. We'll then open up for discussion briefly. We'll see if we can take any questions from the room, and there'll be questions online as well, and hopefully we can get to all of the questions. And then we'll move for closure. I do want to state as well that the presentation made and the executive summary report will be made available to everyone online and will be posted to the website along with this development dialogue recording, which will be quite useful going forward. The report itself was unfortunately not exactly ready today. We've thus made the executive summary. It's a little 6-page document, which we'll circulate in PDF form, and we've got printed copies in the room as well for the participants present. And then hopefully sometime next week, the report will be ready and we can circulate that and actually fully get into it. And I'm sure we'll get more questions as the Just Transition Labour Centre and as TIPS as to what the report means. Going forward, just so that everyone knows, the Just Transition Labour Centre as well is going to hold some more workshops on the report itself. We're going to meet with some of our comrades in the unions, in the federations, and have some workshops. We are planning to go to Mpumalanga and host a few workshops there, meet with some unions and both workers and communities in the area, and tease out the implications of the report. Again, our process as the Just Transition Labour Centre is to make evidence-based information available to the labour movement in general and to assist them to work with what that means. We hope that this information from this report and the other research we've got coming will be able to turn different kind of collective bargaining demands, policy demands, will be in front of NEDLAC and as we do in the labour movement. So we would like that to be something we focus on in taking the report forward. And with that, I think I did say a presentation will be available. Just again, we get that question so often, it'll be made available. It's lengthy. The report is very lengthy as well. So as soon as it's ready, we'll be on TIPS's website, and we'll make sure that through our networks, we'll make sure people know that it's available and people can read it and digest it and send it around and kick it about. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to actually open up to the team to come and present. And then after that, like I said, we'll move into our discussion and the rest of the development dialogue. So thank you, and it's open. Over to you. Thanks, Rod.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming, and thank you to TIPS for funding this research and for giving us an opportunity to talk about it. My name is Rod Crompton. So this is a summary of a 150-page report. And to squeeze that into a short presentation means you have to leave a lot of stuff out. So if you're interested in this subject, I'd urge you to get hold of the whole report, because we really can't cover everything in this presentation. This is a second report, if you like. This is the previous report we did in 2024. And the key findings there were that Sasol plays a central role in the South African economy. Decarbonisation is not a viable route for maintaining Secunda output. Secunda is the main site for Sasol. They also have another site in Sasolburg. Replacing coal with green hydrogen, biomass, feedstocks, or carbon capture and storage, it's not feasible and it's not economic. Sasol faces a host of structural challenges, and Secunda, we say, is in a sunset phase. So that report is already available on the TIPS website. So this is all about just transition. And the reason we are here today is because of that man there, Tony Mazzocchi. He was a leader in the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers International Union in the United States. And he's the brains behind this concept of the just transition. He said paying people to make the transition from one kind of economy to another is not welfare. Those who work with toxic materials on a daily basis in order to provide the world with the energy and materials it needs deserve a helping hand to make a new start in life. So in January 1985, I had a meeting with Tony in New York, and we discussed two things. The first thing was the reason I was in New York. I was sent there by the union I worked for, the Chemical Workers Industrial Union, as part of an international campaign that the union was running. And the campaign was to get Sasol Secunda to reinstate the 6,500 workers they had fired in November 1984. And unions in the US have some leverage, big pension funds and connections and so on. So we discussed that issue. The second thing we discussed was the just transition. Tony was working on it, developing the ideas and leading that whole debate. And now here we are, 41 years later, talking about the just transition. So the authors are Noreen Khan, who's a labor relations specialist, runs the Employment Relations Exchange, previously been chief director at the Department of Labor for Labor Relations, director of the CCMA, and lots of other activities. Then we have Tristan Hahn, who's the CEO of TH Eco Ventures. He's a chemical engineer with 30 years experience across chemicals, refining and energy sectors. He's focused on carbon management, global gas to liquids, coal to liquids, and he combines technical, strategic and business expertise in sustainability. Next to him is Bruce Young, and each of them will be saying something about this report as we go along. He's also a chemical engineer with 30 years experience at Sasol, currently with the Wits Business School, as I also have a role there as well. I'm Rod Crompton. I have a long history with Sasol. I've negotiated with them, I've negotiated against them, I've done many investigations into them, the Windfall Tax Task Team, the Arthur Anderson report concerning the subsidies Sasol used to receive. There, I could talk all day about things I've done in relation to Sasol, been an expert witness in court cases against them and written reports about them, researched them. Part of my PhD was about them, so I know a bit about Sasol. So this report is really focused on Sasol South Africa, workers in local communities and Secunda in particular. It's about jobs, local economies, and planning before it's too late. So what questions was this research trying to answer? Well, it was, as Lev mentioned, an attempt to provide a factual foundation that stakeholders can use to define practical pathways forward, manage the trade-offs, and identify areas for coordinated action in the context of a potentially declining operations in Secunda and Sasolburg. It's also partly about what the consequences might be of an unmanaged sunset of Sasol's plants in Sasolburg and Secunda. So what is a just transition? Well, there are many definitions, but it's all about protecting workers and communities as the economy shifts to cleaner energy. It was created by the unions, and I've mentioned Tony Mazzocchi already. It means early warning and planning. It means training and new skills. It means decent work alternatives and fair support for communities and families. It requires lots of funding and supporting government policies. What we learned in this research is that no one is opposed to the just transition, but everyone hopes that someone else will pay for it. It's about planning, skills, support, and not leaving employees behind. So there are many definitions. It's rooted in Gro Harlem Brundtland's famous statement about sustainable development, this whole idea that the human species on this planet want to survive and not go extinct. And in order to do that, you can't continue eating up your environment at the rate at which we are going. You have to have a sustainable relationship with planet Earth. And if you don't, well, so this is an extension of that kind of thinking. Sasol says it accords with the Presidential Climate Commission just transition definition, which is too long to read, but I've just highlighted in yellow some of the words they use: quality of life, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's the only real firm point in this rather waffly definition. People at the center of decision making, build resilience of people in the economy, especially for the most vulnerable. Lots of nice sounding words. The real trick, of course, is turning those nice words into concrete actions that can be implemented. As the unions say, there are no jobs on a dead planet. South Africa hasn't ratified the ILO convention, or guidelines, I should say, on just transition. Many of the development economies are still at the planning stage of how to do this. Nobody has got the absolute law on how to implement or these kinds of things. And from the union side, COSATU has been the main contributor to the South African debate about what a just transition is or should be. So from our research, the international and local takeaways are that, workers and communities who depend on fossil fuels will oppose so-called green policies unless there's support for them. What's the old saying? Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. The transition to net zero will be neither sustainable nor credible if it creates or worsens social inequalities. A backlash is likely if the transition does not appear to be just. Renewables jobs are not necessarily in the coal mining areas, more likely to be where the renewable resources are better. Will renewables and the fourth industrial revolution enable jobs in other non-energy sectors of the economy? That's the big question. Very difficult to answer, of course. A lot of people talk about support for local content. It sounds very nice, like minerals beneficiation sounds very nice. A lot of people talk about it, but the experts tell us that local content reduces economic development. In South Africa, we have some promise in rare earths mining and battery industry manufacture as a start to South Africa's participation in the new economy. The gender impacts of the just transition are significant, substantial and psychological, but they need further research. Very little research in South Africa about that aspect. And most people seem to agree that to run a just transition implementation, you need some institutional home for it, probably in government, so that someone is holding the steering wheel. Otherwise, things might wander all over the road, or we might not be clear where the road is. So Germany's vocational training model is worth considering by all parties, if there's the money. Obviously, Germany has a lot more money than South Africa. Sasol has interesting partnerships with the TVET colleges and a bunch of other institutions, which are a good start. It's one of the most important corporate investors in education. Quite interesting in South Africa. Sasol does have mining social labor plans, which is a statutory requirement, and that might be a very useful basis for unions to work from. So I'm going to hand over to Noreen now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rod. So we've started off going along, and you will see that our team is quite representative, and I am now going to talk a little bit more about employment stuff, but I'm the only female on the team. So in relation to that, and I've had to deal with, well, Rod is at least a labor supporter for me. Everybody else are techno nerds, so don't ask me any of the techno nerd questions. What I'm going to be talking about is much more to do with employment issues and labor issues in relation to our research. And there's lots more in the report. So please, can I say that to you, because we had to try and decide what we were going to cover and what we weren't going to cover in relation to this. So this first slide talks about what are the people who are employed at Sasol. What do they look like? Okay. And as you can see, it starts off talking about what the worker age distribution of the people are at Sasol. And why have we highlighted this? Because it's different to those in renewables around the world and in the global oil sector. Why is this important? Okay. Well, firstly, we know that you've got to transfer skills, and there's importance in relation to that. So we need to say, what is this data telling us? So firstly, I've just thrown up a graph to you all, and let me just take you through it. I apologize for not doing that. So just for those online, and everybody can see, the turquoise or the blue, if you can see it easier, is Sasol employees. The purple, it's my favorite color, is global oil and gas, and the renewables is green, of course, appropriately in relation to that. The data is telling us that there are quite a number of young people who are in Sasol, but it's below the norm in the world, okay? And what does this tell us? Why do we have that? Well, there's some questions we need to ask around that, you know? Why are there so few young people employed in the area in relation to that compared to other industries around that? And why are there so many people in Sasol in the middle age groups between 35 and 55? And what are they doing there? And then if you look to the older sector, okay, what is happening there? There are fewer people who are employed. Now, if you need to look at a just transition issue, what's going to happen? We need to look at skills transfer, and age. So let's start off with one of the things that we reference is a report by Professor Haroon Bharat, and I'm sure many of you know him. He's at the UCT, but he talks very strongly, and his research he did is about the fact that the average coal miner in South Africa, and it's very important in relation to Sasol, is 38 years old. Now, Rod has just referred to looking at the German model, and when they did the work in the Rhine area, the average coal miner there was much older, late 40s, early 50s. Our average coal miner is 38 years old. What they did is they looked at people retiring, putting people into early retirement. You couldn't do that in South Africa in relation to people. You can't put people at 38 years old into retirement. And in any event, and the people in labor in the listening to us will know in South Africa, unlike in Germany, we don't have a good social wage where people could be supported by the state in any event. So you would have to do different things. So we have to also look at re-educating people and the issues in relation to that. So it's an important point to understand when we're looking at things in the just transition in relation to South Africa. So that's why we pointing out to everyone that there's huge differences in relation to the portfolio or the representation of the workers in Sasol and in the communities in that they service. Moving on, the next point that we want to make, and again, it's relevant to what I've just talked about, and that is the qualifications of the workers as well as their racial distribution in South Africa. And let's have a look at that carefully. The very tall column is NQF4, and we've explained at the bottom because I know we all talk about NQF levels, people get confused what they are. NQF4 is if you've got a matric certificate. NQF10 is like the colleagues here, like Dr. Crompton, you've just heard from, and Dr. Young, who we'll hear from a little bit later. They are people with PhDs. Very few of those around, but a large amount of people with matric certificates. Now, one of the things that we know around the world is that in just transitions, you need to reskill people. And in reskill people, it's really good to take people who've got matric to then move them on to be reading skilled. But can you reskill a 38-year-old mine worker as an example? Okay. I mean, are they open to that? But likewise, do they have the adequate education and are they interested? Because one of the things that you see in lots of the readings, and it's very relevant in relation to South Africa, is the education appropriate? Now, I'm going to show you in the slides that we talk about, and it's certainly in the report, that Sasol is doing a lot of work and growing their people in rate, but it's not enough. Okay. But you can see, if you look clearly at the slide, that there is a huge dearth of people who are crying out for education. And if we are going to respond to the need, we need to do it now. We don't need to wait in relation to that. It's important because what we also know about the just transition is that often if these things come and sunsets happen, people have to be mobile and they have to move on and they have to have new skills in relation to that. And they have to move forward in the context of that. What do we say insofar as labor is concerned? And what are we talking about? We've tried to summarize some of the findings here about bargaining, about skills, about labor, communities, and business. I'm going to be a little bit unpopular about some of my findings, but they're important. In collective bargaining agreements, just transition issues are not very well reflected. And there's a huge resistance to change, especially when they're resisting and they threaten current jobs or current operating models. I'm extremely concerned that this is not being an area of focus, and I think it must be taken up very, very strongly. And that leads into the second point, and that is in the work that we tried to do and the points that we tried to raise, in using the broad insight that I have into the labor movement, senior labor members certainly understand the just transition and they understand the issues and they and pay under strategic understanding to the importance of the just transition and the principles of it. But when you dig down into the day-to-day organizer on the shop floor, they really are not educated enough about it and they don't see it as a major priority. And I think that that's a really big, important call for action because they need to understand the importance of it. And I told Matthew earlier that I was going to use this analogy, and I think it's an important call. I was the Chief Director for Labor Relations, as he indicated earlier, or as Rod indicated earlier, in the early 2000s. And I can recall saying to a very senior COSATU member who then became a very important leader in government subsequently, in my portfolio was the Employment Equity Act. And I said to him, when is Labour going to start arguing for employment equity? And he said to me, when they've got proper bargaining rights. And my comment is, and here we are. And I think in 20 years' time, I'm going to say about the just transition, and here we are. I really believe that there needs to be a call to understand that the just transition in skills must be dealt with right now. And it's an important call to deal with it at this point. Union leaders need to be aware all the way down. I found very lack of knowledge, very lack of understanding, and that's a really important point. I need to also point out that there is a very good bargaining relationship within Sasol. It's a unionized environment at certain levels, obviously. They bargain at different levels. They're part of the Chemical Industry Bargaining Council. In mining areas, they bargain differently. They're part of the various areas in relation to that. The Sasol also has a lot of other areas, and it's important to understand that they are doing a very good job in relation to the policies in that context. They have a very large corporate social investment, but that corporate social investment is very strongly focused on their fence line communities. And of course it has to be, because those are the people around them. Those are the people within their areas. They're within the people who are right there. And it is quite a heavy area, and a lot of people need support. I looked strongly into the municipalities in the area and what the work they're doing. And if those of you who know anything about municipal requirements, they've also, in those municipalities, are required to have a report on what they're doing about the future of their municipalities and growing the people and supporting the communities. And there's nothing. They've got no actual support and reports or future reports around how they would reinvigorate the community or anything in relation to that. And all of that falls to Sasol, and it just can't. It's not fair. It's not appropriate in relation to that. Sasol spends significantly on its CSI, but it's a drop in the ocean of what's required and what's going to be needed in a community that may be denuded in relation to that. And it's important for everybody to understand, while they're doing an amazing job and they're growing people in relation to that, it can't be left to them alone. It's not only their job. That's why I'm emphasizing how important it is that there's early engagement, there's early growth, there's early transition, there's early training, early skilling of people in relation to that, to make sure that people can move along in relation to that. Sasol just can't be required to do this alone. Where is the money going to come from? Where and who will be responsible for doing this? It can't only be Sasol's job. If this happens and if it goes forward, need to skill people, need to bring people along, and need to find different industries for people to move forward. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Tristan Hahn, who will talk about Komati. It's a very interesting and held up as a world example, but he's going to give us some ideas around that. Tristan.
So why are we talking about Komati? I think for many people, Secunda's just a name, somewhere far away in Mpumalanga. And in reality, it's many, many square kilometers of an industrial complex. We looked around the world to try and do some benchmarking. Everybody likes a benchmark. And in essence, South Africa is quite unique together with India, in the sense that we are heavily reliant on coal, number one, and two, we have a relatively low GDP. And so other possible examples you might want to look at are places like Germany, where they took decades to do a transformation out of coal. But in reality, we actually end up back at home in South Africa looking at Komati. Komati is really interesting because if you read the news headlines, you would read immediate success, $500 million raised. That all sounds fantastic. But if you look a little bit deeper, it's actually a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated. Part of the challenge with the money, it's not all grant money. It's not just given to you. It's various forms of loans that have to be repaid over time. And projects have to be developed to support that. Someone has to guarantee those loans. And also the reality of doing the implementation. It's not so easy either. That's really tough. It's taken much, much longer than people have anticipated. But nevertheless, it still represents an interesting and homegrown benchmark for us to have a look at. The reality is, compared to Secunda, Komati is just a drop, a tiny drop. If you look at the graph over there in terms of jobs, Komati is only the coal conversion part. It takes coal and turns it into electricity. It doesn't look at the upstream miners. We've looked at the combination of Sasol Mining and the rest of Sasol. And our estimate, for what it's worth, is you're going to need a decade plus of time and enormous amounts of money if you want to do a just energy transition in Sasol. And so what is the message here? You need a lot of money, a lot of time, but if you don't recognize that there's a problem coming somewhere in the future, none of that's going to help. And so Komati is a warning to us about how difficult this is, and we need to start now thinking about how is this going to happen. So let's have a little look at a jobs pyramid, how Secunda fits into this. And Secunda is interesting because it takes coal that's otherwise worthless. It's full of ash, can't really use it in a power station. So it has no value to anybody else. It's worth, if you calculate it out, maybe $2 a gigajoule in energy terms. And through a lot of beating and transformation, turns it into things, fuels that are worth maybe $15 a gigajoule, 7 times as much, and chemicals that are double that again, 30 times as much. And that's all value that's created in South Africa, in country, that otherwise would just not exist. It saves us it creates GDP in the country. It saves us from imports, protects our foreign exchange reserves. And at the same time, it creates an enormous amount of jobs. The complexity of the process of turning coal into fuels and electricity requires lots and lots of people and lots of contractors and services, pays lots and lots of salaries. And so in some industries, you have a fairly narrow job pyramid. You create a few jobs, you create a few indirect and induced jobs that are out there. That's not Secunda. Secunda is a much more broad-based pyramid because of the complexity. And you'd be tempted to think that something has to be profitable to create lots of jobs. Actually not. Sometimes the opposite is true. That gap between $2 a gigajoule for coal and $15, $20 gigajoules of product, a lot of that gets spent inside the economy on salaries, on contractors, on suppliers, and some of it goes to shareholders. That's all creating value for the country. So this graph tries to reflect that. Sasol in mining has about 8,000 direct jobs. That supports another 41,000 indirect and induced jobs. Indirect are suppliers and contractors. Induced are the jobs created by the employees spending their salaries. This is the standard way that economists look at industries and businesses. Under that are essentially Sasolburg and Secunda, around 17,000 direct jobs and around 410,000 indirect and induced jobs. The important part of this forms the top of the pyramid, but there's all the layers below that you have to think about, which are equally important. And so Sasol, if you look at its products, they provide wholesale and retail fuel. About half of what they make is in the fuel space. And then the other half is in the plastics and chemicals space. And we'll touch on that a bit later. Critically, there are things that go into mining, which are explosives, fertilizers, so those are inorganics. And then there's all the organic chemicals, solvents, inks, paints, coatings, adhesives, and a huge amount of plastics, polyethylene and polypropylene. This part of the pyramid is not particularly well mapped out. There's some information on wholesale and retail, which we've put in the report. The plastics industry has done a pretty good job of mapping it out. Often macroeconomists look at the higher level of the economy. It gets very murky and tough to map out the bottom. And we're very lucky that the plastics industry, actually by measuring from their members physically, rather than trying to theoretically calculate, have provided numbers for plastics. And these are in line with general global numbers for these sorts of industries. And they all reflect the fact that the further down the pyramid you go, the more jobs you create. You hear people talking about beneficiation in country because you want to get down into the bottom parts of the pyramid. Importantly, in our report as well, if you take out Sasol in the middle and you go, okay, now what? Retail and wholesale fuel, in theory, you can import that. There's a big pipeline from the coast. It'll require upgrading. That's a big job, but that's kind of doable. What now for plastics and fertilizers and things like that? That's a problem because one of two things has to happen. You either have to import that stuff, 2 to 3 million tons through our already congested ports and harbors and rail, more trucks on the road. Or people are going to say, well, if we're going to import this stuff, we actually might skip a layer or two and actually just import the final plastic little car that your kid gets rather than buy the pellets and give it to the next guy. Maybe it's just cheaper to import the car and you start losing segments of the economy. So it's really important to recognize Sasol has this broad base, creates a lot of direct and indirect jobs, and there's a whole pyramid sitting underneath it that depends on it. So let's touch on a little bit what's happening on Sasol. This builds on our previous work. And in our view, Sasol is feeling a lot of pressure on a lot of fronts, and I'll talk about 2 of them now. And importantly, there's this theme that Sasolburg and Secunda are connected and interdependent on each other. I'll touch on that in a slide to come. Secunda's primary feedstock is coal. It's 55 million tons of coal. And actually, let me just go back a slide. So this story, you'd be tempted to say, so what could be bad about all of this? The problem is it's based on coal, and there's 55 million tons of CO2 sitting in the background that, looking ahead from a climate perspective, is a problem. And it's a problem for two reasons. It's a huge amount of CO2 in its own right, and it doesn't represent the typical way that you make plastics and chemicals and fuels. So its carbon intensity is maybe 8 times the traditional way of making things. And so when you think about it, you're very exposed. You know, I kind of think of it like a herd of buffaloes. If in the middle of the herd, you're safe. You know, you're kind of rotating occasionally at the edge, and inside the lions on the outside. If you're starting to get towards the back of the herd, you're vulnerable. And that's where things like CBAM and things are going to start putting pressure on you because of this carbon footprint. You're not part of, in climate terms, the business as usual case. You're not business as usual, and you have to be thinking a whole lot more carefully and thoughtfully about what is your plan in a climate constrained future and how it knocks on into jobs. Sorry. So there are two feedstocks out there that Sasol uses, a large amount of coal. Secunda was designed in the 70s. It was built on top of the coal fields, but there's been 45 years of coal mining. So that coal is further and further away, and the quality is getting worse and worse and worse. And that's a problem. That's kind of the natural cycle of life for a lot of these things. But it's coming, and it's 45 years. At the same time, for Sasolburg, natural gas was brought into South Africa from Mozambique in the early 2000s. That's also running out. There's a lot of discussion, you've probably seen in the news, about replacement of it. But I think from a Sasol economics perspective, trying to use LNG to make fuels in Secunda is just not going to work. LNG is too expensive as a feedstock. These plants were designed in the 70s with a slide rule. They were born out of a need for energy security. Energy efficiency wasn't a thing at the time. Climate change didn't exist at the time. And now there's a lot of pressure. And if you have an inefficient process, you need a cheap feedstock. And so LNG just doesn't fit with that. So I think for us, Sasol's people, planet, profit ambition, trying to balance this is getting increasingly tricky over time. Let's have a look at the numbers for a moment. Nareen touched on this. Sasol spends 21 billion rand on employee salaries. It's a massive amount of money. That's part of those induced jobs that we saw on the previous graphs. They invested $1 billion almost in social initiatives, but they're under pressure. You know, we can talk all we want about there's margin squeeze and feedstock and all sorts of things, but often the metric that pulls all of these things together is the share price. And if you look at the graph in the bottom right, you can see that's been meandering down from the 2023 timeframe. It's taken a serious shot in the arm boost with the war in Iran, but that's not, hopefully for us, not going to be a long-term thing. And those pressures are going to resume, but everybody wants a breathing space, and I think Sasol is extremely grateful for that. So let's go back to looking at this sort of chemicals pyramid. Almost everything we have here is made of hydrocarbons, and those sources are coal, oil, and gas. And they form the base of that pyramid. And Sasol sits right in the middle for feedstocks. It makes basic chemicals, and it makes chemical intermediates. It makes some of the final products, as we saw earlier, explosives and resins. And then there's a whole massive tranche of end-use products that are out there, and we've tried to kind of label which are the ones we think that they participate in. So yeah, they touch all parts of our economy. We also spent some time mapping out in more detail this level of integration and synergy between Secunda and Sasolburg. They are tightly linked. There are pipelines, trains and trucks that travel between the two of them, and they've grown together over time and taken advantage of synergies between the two sites. And the challenge here is people think of Secunda and Sasolburg differently. They're not. They're dependent on each other, and if the one falls, it weakens the remaining one. And they have different challenges. Secunda has coal that is more expensive, low quality, further away on the feedstock side, and it uses some gas. Sasolburg is completely dependent on gas, which is running out, we know, sometime in the 2030s. But now Sasolburg processes all of Secunda's ethylene, and there's nothing else to do with it. So now you have to keep parts running in a non-economic fashion, so Secunda has to cross-subsidize. And so this is a challenge that these destinies are intertwined, and if you start trying to unroll it, you start picking up anti-synergies over time. So we try to map out that space. There are other companies that are affected there, build out all the different products in the different categories, and then below it, all the different markets. That us also had a look at how Sasol performing in the chemical space. Sasol often just pitches their headline numbers, 7.5 million tons, 7.3, and you don't see the numbers in between. Chemicals add a lot of value. And by looking at trade data and plant capacities in the public domain, you can start getting a sense of what's actually going on in the operational space. And you can see this pressure coming on all fronts. Okay, I think that's all from me. I think now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Bruce Young. Thanks, Bruce.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. So I think there's going to be a little bit of repetition here on this slide. Tristan's already talked about, they've got 27,000 direct and 425,000 other jobs in South Africa, dependent in South Africa, and could be affected. And the thought experiment that we're doing here is, what are the potential consequences of restructuring and the sunset phase of Secunda and Sasolburg? The Secunda and Sasolburg towns, and in particular Secunda, are company towns. I think Secunda is the very definition of a company town. And so they rely heavily on Sasol. And so it's a big restructuring that is likely in both towns. And we're going to keep beating the drum here that the planning needs to start now. And we'll come back to that theme later. Also, the cutbacks are unlikely to happen all at once. Half of Sasolburg, for example, is based on gas feedstock. The other half processes feedstock from Secunda. As the gas runs out in Sasolburg, there's an inevitable restructuring coming there. So the cutbacks are not likely to happen all at once. We're heavily linked into the South African economy. And Tristan talked about it, the plastics production, for example, multiplies into 20,000, 5,000 direct jobs downstream. That's one of the things that we cover in our report. And unfortunately, there was information on that from Plastics SA. And then the point there that skills in coal-based industries don't easily transfer to solar, wind, or new industries, and even less so for unskilled workers. So we just the kicker box there. Without a plan, thousands of jobs and entire communities are at higher risk. Okay, so what are the challenges facing Sasol South Africa? Financial. The position is fragile. Sasol has high debt, a weak balance sheet, and profits are too low to fund full-scale technological transformation. That's one of the things that we covered quite a lot in our first report. Then the feedstock issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in the coming slides. The coal situation, the volume decline, quality issues, and transport costs, and the gas running out by the mid-2030s, and LNG is not affordable. Then there's an aging plant. It's not profitable to replace. So the plant can't be economically reconstructed once it's reached end of life. So it's not profitable to replace it. And then the emissions and shareholder impatience. We'll talk about they'll talk a little bit about the 30% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. That is an enormous challenge. Then one of the things we found in our report is that the chemicals that Sasol's producing are facing some declining volumes. Talk briefly about that. And then increasing Chinese and global price pressure. The global chemical environment is incredibly competitive and oversupplied. And then the strategy beyond 2028, I'll talk about that in the next slides. There's not much published by Sasol on that at the moment. And then Tristan just talked about the oil price relief from the Iran war, and certainly higher oil prices are a very significant tailwind for Sasol. Being an old warhorse in the oil and petrochemical industry, I'll just make this one remark. Since 1987, when Brent oil price first came into existence, in a rolling 6-month period, the oil price has changed by more than 30%, 88 times. So why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because the oil price is fundamentally unpredictable. And don't get fooled by the current oil price. It will change, and it will change by a lot. And it's based on geopolitics and complex things. And so just because the oil price is high now, don't assume that it'll always be high. And in fact, the longer it remains high, potentially, a large downward movement is entirely possible. But right now, it is a significant tailwind for Sasol. Okay. Now I want to talk about Sasol's plans in the Capital Markets Day, which was in May 2025. And I just want to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Sasol said about in its Capital Markets Day. And I also want to do a little bit of contrasting to what Sasol said in its 2021 Capital Markets Day, because they're quite different. So financial, prioritized debt reduction. Feedstocks, coal, commission the destoning. That's to do with the quality issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The gas, it's declining. There's no replacement. Emissions, stick to targets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's the 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Chemicals, increase output as far as possible because chemicals have a higher value than liquid fuels. Then strategically increase output, Secunda output by 15% to 7.4 million tons per annum by 2028. If we go back to the 2021 Capital Markets Day, they were talking about reducing output to 6.7 million tons in order to reduce carbon emissions by 30%. So Sasol's now changed its mind on that and is prioritizing our production. And then reduce the break-even oil price from $59 a barrel to $50 a barrel by 2030. A focus on cost-cutting, operational efficiencies, and improved energy integration. So those are some of the very high-level takeaways from Sasol's Capital Markets today. Okay. So now we're going to do a little bit of a sort of an outside in, looking at just unpacking what Sasol's saying in its Capital Markets Day, and then also what was unsaid, because I think it's important to also look at some of the things that are unsaid. So what we've got on this slide is Sasol's plans, and there you can see we've got our authors' comments. This is something that amongst the four of us, we debated them a lot, and to just look at what Sasol is saying. So prioritize debt reduction. We've put in there sensible. The balance sheet is overstretched. Sasol's bonds are in junk territory. So a balance sheet repair is appropriate and sensible. And to the extent that the high oil prices are a tailwind for Sasol, once hedging expires, it's a very sensible thing for Sasol to be doing. So feedstocks, coal, commission destoning, a very, very important thing for Sasol, but the coal cost and quality decline trend will likely persist after nearly 50 years of mining, and we'll deal with that in the next slide. Gas decline with no replacement. So there's no economically viable gas replacement that has been disclosed and unlikely to be the case. Right, what was not said? The aging plant, no published plan by Sasol, it's approaching 50 years old. It's got a more or less 300 billion rand replacement cost, and reinvestment is not commercially viable. So emissions stick to targets, sensible, but now using offsets. Okay, so let me first of all go back to what Sasol was doing in 2021. In 2021, they said they were going to cut production in order to meet the 30% emission target. Now the strategy is to maximize production, which means that Sasol will not be able to meet the 30% emission target, so it's promised, in Secunda itself from the plant. So now they need to use offsets. So Rod said to me, I need to explain carefully what offsets are. So offsets are very simply that instead of reducing carbon emissions at Secunda, you invest or pay for projects which will reduce carbon emissions somewhere else. So for example, reforestation or investing in renewable energy projects somewhere else. And so then on a net basis, you do meet your targets. That's the theory. I will say that carbon offsets are extremely controversial. When you go and look into the literature, there are all kinds of difficulties with measuring the offsets, with whether the projects to reduce emissions might have happened anyway, and also in certain cases, there's been some fraudulent activity in offsets. So if you go into the literature in offsets, it's a complex field. Okay, chemicals increase output. That's a sensible thing for Sasol to do and try and maximize chemicals output in Secunda. Chemicals have a higher value than fuels, so a very sensible thing to do. Increase output by 15% to 7.4 million tons per annum by 2028. Very, very sensible approach for the financial health of Secunda. I'll come to the comment in the next slide about Sasol's forecasting a decline to 6.4 million tons per annum by 2034. And then reduce the break-even oil price from 59 barrels to 50 barrels per day by 2030. And there we've put in brackets, that's a complex aspirational target. There's nothing wrong with setting a complex aspirational target, but it's not a given. There are a lot of moving parts in trying to achieve that. But certainly it's a worthy target and a worthy goal, and understandable that Sasol set that target. Then a focus on cost-cutting, operational efficiencies, improved energy integration. That's sensible, and not much we can say other than hope that succeeds. Then what's not said? Little on green hydrogen, part of lower carbon pathways. And the reason I highlight that is because that was actually central to the 2021 Capital Markets Day. So there has been appears to be a significant change within Sasol, focusing hard on green hydrogen to transform Secunda. That Sasol is now essentially silent on that. And then this is really Marine's bullet point at the bottom. The latest Capital Markets Day presentation does not mention labour policy as a part of a just transition. Okay. Then let's just talk about coal mining productivity for Secunda. There's a nice graph there on the left-hand side showing mining productivity and cost. Mining productivity has been in a long-term decline, as you can see by the blue curve there, and the cost per ton has been going up steadily. So there's a cost squeeze going on there. And just a couple of bullet points. The Isabonelo colliery supplying 10% of Secunda's coal is depleted, and the supply contract expired in 2025. All mines have a finite life. This mine just reached end of life. And the long-term replacement coal supply is uncertain. So, for example, there's no announced decision on a new coal mine by Sasol or the Alexander project, and coal unit costs continue rising, and there's a dependence on external coal supply increasing, so which adds logistics costs and which contributes to the picture that we're showing on the left-hand side. So there's an overall trend of rising feedstock costs, worsening coal quality, and growing supply security risks. Now, this is a structural issue. Secunda has been mining coal for coming up for 50 years now, and no mine lasts forever, and so you're having to source coal from further and further away, and so it's just contributing to rising costs. And then just to point out that Sasol uses roughly 8 tons of coal per ton of liquid product, which means that from a greenhouse gas perspective, that's not a pretty picture and is an outlier in the world environment. So for things like CBAM, this is a problem. Now let's just talk about Secunda production, because that's absolutely central to looking at the future of Secunda. So to state something that certainly to techno nerds like myself, Tristan and Rod, is a statement of obvious. Secunda economics are highly volume sensitive. So lower output weakens profitability and cash flow. Secunda has very high fixed costs. And in order to cover those fixed costs, you need production. And so if production goes down, your fixed costs are hard to reduce. And so your profitability declines. And certainly I just tell an anecdote of when I used to travel to Secunda many times. As you came into the factory, there was an enormous billboard showing production thus far this year, production target, bonuses were paid on reaching a target. So that's just to emphasize how important the production volumes are for Secunda. So now, and we talked about it before, the Sasol has reversed its earlier greenhouse gas-driven coal reduction strategy and going pedal to the metal for production. So it's now targeting 7.4 million tons by 2028. And let's just now look at the graph. So on the graph, we can see that Secunda production has been facing a long-term decline essentially since 2019. So that's a persistent trend, and understandably, that trend cannot continue and Secunda to continue to operate. They have to address that, and it's understandable that that's the plan. So you can see the forecast going to 7.4 by 2028. And I must just mention again, and I'll go back to the issue of aspirational. It's an aspirational forecast. It's not a guarantee that will be achievable in practice. But they look at let's look at the rest of the Sasol's forecast. If you go into the 2025 financial statement, you can still see projected long-term decline. So output falling to 7 million tons by 2030 and 6.4 million tons from 2034. And so if you look at that whole trend, there's aspirational hope to get to 7.4 million tons per annum by 2028, and let's hope that happens. But then after that, there's a decline. And that's driven by, a large part of that is driven by the natural gas decline, and no more natural gas by 2034. So Yeah, I mean, this is briefly on the coal destalling project. It's intended to improve feedstock quality and stabilize production. And that's been commissioned, and all indications are that that project's going well. Okay, this is, I think this is my last slide before Rod will close the discussion. Yeah, and the just transition and the risks of doing nothing. Well, first of all, there's a loss of technical expertise. We talked about the jobs, families, and the towns that are at risk, and a big hole that will be left in the South African economy. And just in case you think this can't happen, we've seen it before. We've seen this movie before. 2 oil refineries in eThekwini, Durban, closed suddenly, abruptly, thousands of jobs gone. ArcelorMittal shutting their steel operations, again, no plan. These were just events, and the consequences unfolded in an unplanned way. So our message is that planning needs to start now to reduce job losses, broken towns, and develop safety nets. With that, I'm going to hand over to Rod.
Let me just first of all apologize. In my introductory remarks, I didn't mention that, like in the previous report, for this report, we had requested cooperation from Sasol and we received cooperation from Sasol. So we're very grateful for that cooperation that we received from Sasol. So now we have to confront some brutal facts as South Africa. The bottom line is that equipment and machinery, and Secunda is basically a giant machine with lots of little machines inside it. It has a finite life. It doesn't last forever. There's going to be a point where it becomes too expensive to repair or replace those machines. And that's what we are really talking about. Or new technologies will emerge which will make it uncompetitive. I think Bruce mentioned competition from Chinese petrochemicals producers. It reminds me, 10 years ago, I wrote a piece called something along the lines of South African petrochemicals are in a cul-de-sac. Secunda is the only source of petrochemicals in this economy. And for 50 years, there's been no plan what to do after Secunda for petrochemicals. So when will Sasol, Secunda run into problems? Well, we know what the gas supply is doing. We've got a forecast from Sasol, but for the rest, it's difficult to say. It also depends a lot on the oil price, as Bruce has mentioned, but it could be sooner than we think. It wasn't so many months ago that the oil price was hovering around $60 a barrel. Some of you will remember that, which is only $10 a barrel above Sasol's aspirational target. So as we know, Sasol is vulnerable, and what we are recommending is that it's better to start preparing for the just transition, putting measures in place now, rather than being caught later with nothing. We need to start developing the safety nets that we'll need. So what needs to be done? Well, we're recommending action on all aspects immediately. Workers' unions need to be part of coordinated negotiation and planning on the technical and operational changes, on economic sustainability. We need government, business, and labor to help create retraining programs, support new industries. Communities need to be involved in the local plans. Funding and commitments are key. International partners are offering help, but not enough. A lot has been made in the press of developed countries' support for South Africa. I think 56 billion was mentioned, but when you dig into that, most of that is loans that have to be repaid. I think it's only about 5% which are cash grants. So a very small percent of cash grants. The rest is just debt. And ask any South African household about debt. Most households have got significant debt. We think a transition that's planned is better than leaving it to the markets. So unfortunately, there are no easy answers. We are, in a sense, leading the world in this as a developing country, and we're going to have to make it up as we go. All of the steps are going to involve complex trade-offs. Industrial competitiveness is an issue. Social protection is an issue. Environmental concerns are a real issue. One of Secunda's claims to fame is it's the largest single point emitter of CO2 on planet Earth. So it's a significant challenge. What is the government appetite for capacity interventions? When I'm being rude about the government, which is not very often, but I say that, the current industrial strategy for these plant closures is wait to the 11th hour and then panic. And that's what we would like to advocate we should not do in this case. Can we afford not to act now? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. Happy news. Happy news. The report is, like I said, going to be available next week, we hope. And I do want to thank the team for all the work that they've done. It's been a while that we've been working on this. I do also want to remind everyone there is a previous report that they referred to as well, that in work they did for TIPS, and these two relate, and I urge you to go look at that one as well before reading this one. We will circulate the presentation again, and we're going to move now into having Andile Zulu just take us through as our discussion for this section. There are a number of questions that are coming up online, which we'll deal with after our discussant has a bite. And then also a number of changing elements since the report had been worked on that have come up through the news and a variety of other situations that we can also address. But I'd like to just introduce Andile Zulu. He's the Energy Democracy Officer at the Alternative Information and Development Centre in Cape Town. His work focuses on research and advocacy on issues of climate justice, just energy transitions, and energy poverty as well. He's also a political commentator who's written on social political issues for publications such as Jacobin, Mail and Guardian, Africa as a Country, and The Continent. And he's joining us now as our discussion, and hopefully he can bring out some of the aspects of this report. And after he is done, we can move into some discussions. We can open up to the floor here for questions and deal with some of those online. And hopefully we'll stay on time, but we've got until about 1 o'clock or so. So let's get into a bit of it. Andile, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to TIPS for the invitation, the authors of the reports, and everyone who was able to join both in person and on Zoom. I hope I am clear and audible. I see time is always a struggle. So I'm going to try and be efficient as possible with kind of trying to bring out what I think are the central issues and questions that are raised in this report, which you had a taste of through the presentations. And I think it's quite dense and insightful and detailed. And I think once it's available widely, it's going to be useful to everyone who's in attendance. So essentially, I think what the report captures is that Sasol, its operational issues, its structural challenges that it's currently facing, even before you reach the issue of climate change and South Africa's agenda for decarbonization. What this report captures is a dilemma that I think reaches beyond just Sasol. And essentially, it's the issue of South Africa has been undergoing premature deindustrialization for the past 20 or so years. So there's been collapses in infrastructure, there's constraints with energy supply, there have been crippling network industries such as Transnet, for example. There's also been a historic regime of trade liberalization, which has meant that a lot of local industries have died, not being able to compete with cheap imports. And then, of course, there's been a historic decline, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, in public sector investments into not just only state-owned enterprises, but public infrastructure overall. Subsequently, it means that South Africa has faced a stagnant economic growth, quite shockingly stagnant economic growth, and record-breaking levels of unemployment. Right now, if you use an expanded definition of unemployment, including people who are jobless and who have given up on finding jobs, unemployment sits at about 43%. And the recent statistics that were given to us, we've just lost 300,000 jobs in the past, in the first quarter of 2026. And so in the context of now then this commitment to decarbonization in a country that has been dependent on fossil fuels, and where, you know, entities like Sasol have played an essential role for the petrochemicals industry and for manufacturing at large. You have this issue of decarbonization. Industries like entities like Sasol are essential. At the same time, there's a pressing, urgent need for expansive, labor-absorbing economic growth and some kind of industrial strategy that also has to raise the standards of living of millions of people. What do you do with these dirty but strategic assets like Sasol? And, you know, we can't forget, of course, that Sasol is one of the biggest contributors to our carbon emissions globally as well. And of course, we can't also forget that there are real impacts of Sasol's production on people's lives, the violation of emission standards, the pollutions, the cases that Sasol has been brought to. So what is to be done? And a just energy transition is conventionally thought of or recently thought of to be the solution. But the question is, what is meant by an energy transition and what is meant by just? And so often, as was mentioned by speakers throughout, the idea is that, you know, the just transition comes from the tradition of labor unions working in tandem with the environmental movement to say that as we shift away from fossil fuels, as we try to curtail the damage that's being done by the ecological crisis, we also need to ensure that workers and communities who are both at the front line of climate disasters, but also who themselves depend on, for example, in South Africa, the coal value chain, we have to make sure that people aren't left behind. My contention is, and I think this is captured by the report quite well, and again, people will have access hopefully soon to be able to read it, and I think Sasol displays this quite clearly. My contention is that the current model of the just energy transition that is being put forward by government, primarily through the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is likely, I think, to be replicated in Sasol, and Sasol's plans about green hydrogen already, you kind of see this. I think the model is not fit for purpose. It's not fit for purpose in terms of being able to protect livelihoods, local economies and jobs downstream, not just the people who directly depend on Sasol, but as was mentioned before, the impact that Sasol has downstream and on the wider economy. And it does not actually take us closer to being able to effectively decarbonize and adapt. And I just want to highlight some of the things that the speakers have already importantly mentioned. One of the things was this issue of financing, that Sasol is going to require an immense amount of what we call climate financing to be able to begin adapting and transitioning. And where will this money come from? And our contention is the AIDC and other people have, other organizations have brought this up before as well, is that the financing model we have right now that's being adopted in Senegal and Vietnam and Indonesia and other countries is not fit for purpose. As was previously just mentioned, most of the financing comes from foreign loans. And the primary problem with foreign loans, or three big problems, is interest, conditionalities, and what they call bankability or de-risking. So the fact is these loans come with interest, some of it is concessional, but a country is essentially put into a situation where you're paying interest on loans as your currency is generally depreciating compared to the euro or compared to the dollar. And, you know, as you accumulate more loans, as you gather on more debt, the priority of governments often becomes having to service debt at the expense of the strategic public investment that's required to deal with issues such as unemployment, industrial blockages, failures in the network industry, etc. Secondly, the issue is conditionalities, because many of these loans for the just transition in South Africa and around the world are based on a model that says, look, countries in the global south have very little fiscal room to be able to invest in transitioning, whether it means taking entities like Sasol and developing a green hydrogen industry or trying to connect people to local battery manufacturing. They just don't have the resources for it. They don't have the fiscal space, which I think is contentious. I don't think that's a solved debate, but nonetheless, international finance institutions like the World Bank say, for example, we don't have the fiscal space. And so what you need is you need to attract private investments and private developers into renewable energy projects and into transition projects. And in order to do that, you have to make those projects bankable. You have to remove the big risks that come with long-term infrastructure projects, not just in green technologies, but historically in fossil fuel industries and technologies as well. Infrastructure is capital intensive. It takes a long time. Historically, it isn't instantly profitable. It's a long-term kind of investment that comes with many risks. And so to remove the risk of, for example, regulatory delays due to land acquisition issues, to remove the risk of strong unions trying to get better wage agreements, to remove the risk of environmental protections that might happen when you're trying to build a green infrastructure project, etc. In order to remove those risks, you have to essentially deregulate. You have to introduce subsidies, tax breaks, tax incentives. And there's also the problem as well that is increasingly coming up in a lot of the climate justice literature, the issue of, the transaction fees that are required with consultants for these different infrastructure projects as well, and the kind of hidden debt that a government can build up by making sure that projects are attractive to investors, and heavily relying on consultants as well to be able to fill the gaps that they might not be able to deal with. And this is really the issue of climate financing, because again, there are so many communities that depend on Sasol and Secunda as well, right? And so there is going to be a lot of financial support that has to be given to communities that are entrapped in poverty and unemployment, who indirectly depend on Sasol and other fossil fuel entities within the coal value chain. But a problem that's emerged with the just transition financing is the fact that most of the grant money, most of the money that does not have to be repaid, that is meant to go towards community training, upskilling, community development, support for mothers and children, etc. A lot of that financing has been devoured by consultant firms who themselves are quite deeply immersed in the fossil fuel industry as well. So I don't think that the current model of financing is one that points towards solutions that are needed in South Africa. And, as the AIDC and other progressive civil society organizations and trade unions as well have mentioned, it is that we need to have domestic resource mobilization. It is quite absurd that we're the most unequal country in the world, and yet there hasn't been a serious attempt to try and consider how to implement a progressive tax framework where we will be able to mobilize the kind of resources that can go towards properly initiating a just transition that protects communities and protects workers. And I agree as well with the sentiments about planning, that implementing a just transition requires planning. And the planning becomes essentially a lot more difficult when the implementation of green energy projects is dependent on the whims and wishes of private developers and private investors who make decisions on criteria that don't necessarily have to connect with what is best for people on the ground, but rather they have to make considerations in the short term about profitability, returns on investment, maximizing value for shareholders, the health of their portfolios, etc. So we can't have a just transition that depends on private developers if Sasol, as an entity, has to begin planning now about how to avoid the worst impacts of its gradual, I like this term that everyone is using in the reports, of the sunset phase. So there were other things. I think I'm just going to go on just for 5 more minutes. I don't want to take up too much time from the Q&A. But I think one thing that was quite important that was mentioned that is often neglected in the excitement and the hype about the just transition, and the report goes into great detail about this, is the difficulty of reskilling and upskilling workers in the sense that skills in the fossil fuels industry, like with Sasol, are not transferable. And when, as AIDC, when we did our own research into the decommissioning of Komati and the proposed decommissioning of Camden and several other power stations in the near future, a consistent problem that we came upon in the international support, the research backs this up as well in Spain, for example, is that it is quite difficult, in fact, you can't just automatically shift workers into new industries. And this problem of skilling becomes especially clear when you realize that areas like provinces like Mpumalanga, where Sasol's operations are quite key, provinces like Mpumalanga are not the flagship provinces for renewable energy, and that in fact there are also geographic restraints that come through when it comes to where you can develop renewable energy projects, in particular wind and solar, which require huge amounts of land, low density populated areas, etc. And so that becomes a question in provinces like Mpumalanga and areas like Secunda. What are the viable alternatives to be able to protect livelihoods, to be able to build new kinds of economy that raise people's standards of living? Then there's also something that was raised in the reports is about the unpreparedness of unions holistically as organizations. I can't remember which speaker, but they mentioned the fact that leadership at unions have an awareness of the just transition as a concept and themselves have led research and analysis, and they have positions, etc. But in our experience as well, interacting with unions in Emelahleni, Ermelo, Middelburg, we found that the rank and file members are totally unprepared for the just transition, are in fact at times deeply skeptical of the just transition because they often, understandably, see it as a risk to their livelihoods, and they don't trust the plans that are provided to them by government. So there's also the fact that the trade union movement, if you want to call it that, does not have a thorough agenda that runs from the top of the organization straight down to the rank and file member at the power station, at the mine, at the factory. And that becomes a problem because it then means that I think trade unions, are not able to build the kind of leverage that they need to be able to make their demands clear, and to be able to also join in partnership with communities to be able to develop an agenda from below for a just transition. Secondly, one thing I think that the report also points out that I really want to highlight is the problem with the just transition so far in South Africa is the really poor involvement and deliberation with communities. A really big problem in Komati, and if you talk to people in the unions and in Middelburg as well, and many of the people in Mpumalanga who are dealing with the Presidential Climate Commission, for example, or with the Eskom JET office, is they feel that information is not shared. It's not accessible in a way that relates to their experiences, or the kind of scientific information is not accessible and approachable for them. There is shallow consultation. Many community members in Mpumalanga and at the forefront of the just transition feel as if they are having a one-way conversation with the entities that are responsible for proper deliberation and consultation. And so they feel as if these stakeholder consultations do not seriously take their needs and interests into consideration. And many people in Komati will tell you that this was their experience with the decommissioning of the power station. And as one of the speakers said, Komati is not a Sasol in that, it's not a Secunda in that, the ramifications of Sasol's failure are going to be a lot bigger. And so if communities are not on board, if communities do not feel engaged, when things go wrong, you're likely to have a social explosion if you're not able to have people buy in and meaningfully participate in the process. One trade union member said that Komati's shutdown felt like it was a wedding happened, and then the wedding planner was invited afterwards. So that's the sentiment amongst some workers and some communities. Although I will say Eskom management in Komati has done a much better job in recent months to be able to involve people in the process. And so lastly, I think, again, just kind of emphasizing this point about the need for comprehensive social supports. The reality is when you look at transitions in Spain, for example, which had many more years to conduct this process, there are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be losses. The question is, how can you deploy the kind of comprehensive social support for specific actors, again, mothers, young men, women, etc., local businesses and so on, people in the informal economy as well. How can you deploy the kind of comprehensive social support, the kind of public welfare that is able to cushion the blow? And that requires planning, that requires strategy, that requires effective communication. And I think that requires public investment, because then you're able to have democratic oversight. You're able to control the process. You aren't held hostage by the whims of international investors, of private developers who are often not interested in this thing that I'm talking about in general. And I think we should also be concerned about the green hydrogen thing, I'll say. Sasol, I think South Africa is undergoing a reevaluation of green hydrogen, and I think a lot of the excitement is beginning to disappear because of the high production costs, the demand for water in a context of water scarcity, the issues with transporting and storing hydrogen as well. And I think that requires a reevaluation. I think some of the excitement for green hydrogen is misplaced. I will end it there. And again, thank you to Tips for the invitation. And I hope people do enjoy the report when it comes out.
Thank you, Andile. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for bringing out those points as our discussants. I want to jump, excuse me. I want to jump maybe just to some questions that might be pressing in the room currently, if anyone has, and then we can deal with some online, and there are a couple of points we can make after. But let me just see if there's anyone in the room who has some questions that they would like to ask the panel on the discussions. Got one or two. Yes, thanks. After you.
Thanks. Etienne Roberts from Renew E. My question is about the COP26 funding that we would get from the Global North, who say they care. Now, most of that is loans. And as Rod said, it's 5% are actually grants.
Yeah.
Isn't it really just another form of colonialism, in that in the 1800s we had slavery and they took our people? Now they want to do financial colonialism, in that they put us into debt. We have to pay back those loans, and we just get more impoverished. Is global warming not the fault of the global north? They polluted our atmosphere, and now they want us to pay for their problems. Should we not tell them, guys, you give us the money, no loans, no strings, or the only string is we use it properly and doesn't end up in Switzerland, but you give us the money, then we'll decarbonize. And you know what? If you don't, we will continue to pollute and play a game of poker with them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the report presentation. This was very insightful. When we talk about developing safety net, I just wanted to know what happens to workers who are close to retirement or who don't have transferable skills. Is there any plans for early retirement packages? Yeah.
Okay. And we did have one here and then on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob and team, for the report. My curiosity is around, so what's Sasol doing? Is there really engagement around that, around this whole thing, around their future on the one hand, but also more importantly, it seems to me that this thing about Sasol's been in trouble for many years, for many years. And is there any conversation? Because it seems to me you can't have Arcelor. Okay, so put it as resources. You can't have steel go down, primary steel die. You have the two refineries. I've always had a question mark about them anyway. And then you have Sasol going. In terms of manufacturing in South Africa, do we ever pause to say that there is zero manufacturing if the auto sector goes with these two things going? Isn't there some conversation that somebody's having with someone that you need to have? If there were a need for a commission, this for me, in my mind, would be one of those issues that require a commission. $18.5 billion is not a lot of money in my mind when you are talking about the whole South African economy and manufacturing. It's just my thought.
Thank you. And then last from Mohammed, thanks.
Thanks. I guess mine is a bit more of an existential question. You know, they say you really grow up when you come to terms with the fact that you're going to die someday and you're okay with that. So my question is, you know, it's very clear that Sasol and Secunda specifically faces a number of risks from different perspectives, right? On one hand, there's the argument around long-term coal decline and demand for coal. There's the whole gas cliff story. There's the green hydrogen story, where there's lots of challenges and risks, and it's not clear how that's going to pan out. So my question is, you know, do we just come to terms with the fact that Sasol is dying and it's going to die, and there's nothing we can do about it? Or differently, what will it take for Sasol to survive? And do we need to put forward that effort? Or will any effort make a meaningful difference? Because these questions really determine our pathway forward and determines the list or the combination of things that we do about this. Is it purely about dealing with the multiplier effects of lost production from Secunda and the employment impacts? Or is it about actually trying to change the nature of production in the production facilities and whose responsibility that is? So those are just a few reflections and maybe some questions for myself.
Thank you. What I would like to do is address one of the questions, then I'll hand over to the panel and also to Andile to address some of those questions. If there's time, we'll take some online. There've been quite a number coming through, some comments as well. Okay, so I'll say this first. I'm not an academic. I come from the trade union movement, really, but I did publish one paper once, 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. It's only one. But it was the exact question posed about green financing and basically green colonialism as a new form. And I based a lot of my research on sort of what Walter Rodney was talking about. And my argument was fairly similar in the sense that there is a movement in the world around how capitalism works, and with neoliberalism as well, where nations with more money can give money to nations with less money and charge them for it and get the money back, but it is a way for them to make more money. And that's a form of what I call green colonialism, and it seems to be happening, and an argument can be made for that. However, the point remains that the global north is the one that developed the most and exuded the most carbon. But there's another argument that has been made that South Africa, as part of the global south, is one of the nations that has produced a large amount of carbon when it comes to the global south as well. So there are these there's tenuous positions and counter arguments. But the argument I made in that paper was that, yes, it's a form of green colonialism, although I'm not making that argument now in my position at TIPS, but I have published a paper before on it. You can find it if you want, I don't really mind. But I can now open it to the panel first. You guys can come up here, or there's a mic there, but for viewing purposes, you can come up and answer if you would like to answer the questions. And when you're done, I'll hand over to Andile as well.
No,
Just hold it, and then the light will go green.
Okay, put the green light on. I'm going to pass a lot of the difficult questions to my colleagues. I'll just tell the easy ones. So on the first question, I mean, I don't think the debate about colonialism or not is the issue. The issue is there are two big dogs on this planet, USA and China, and there's another dog called Russia. And we are, you know, a little country on the southern tip of Africa. And we think people owe us a favor. They don't. Look at Mr. Trump's attitude towards South Africa. So we just have to be smart and negotiate the best deal that we can, given that we're in amongst the big dogs and we're trying to fight for our survival as a country in amongst the big dogs. On the second question, I'll leave to my colleagues. On the question of, you know, what would it take if Sasol's dying, what would it take to redeem it? Well, as was pointed out, the equipment is old and it's getting older. At a certain point, you have to replace it. When Sasol was built, it was built with significant subsidies from the government and from the people of South Africa. So it figures, if you want to do it again, you better cough up the same amount of subsidy. And, you know, everyone liked the just transition. Everyone thinks it's a good idea, and everyone hopes someone else will pay for it. Yeah. So the question that we should ask ourselves is, how much of our salary are we wishing to sacrifice to replace Sasol? You yourself, how much of your bank balance are you willing to put into replacing Sasol? That's the question when you bring it back to roots. So I'll hand over to Noreen and then.
Thanks, Rod. I'm going to only answer one question, of course, and that's on the retirement issue. And the reality is that, I mean, South Africa's biggest problem is that they don't have safety nets. We don't actually have safety nets, and there are no safety nets being developed. Yes, Sasol as an organization has very, very reasonable and good in a South African comparator benefits for most of its employees, but are they developing additional safety nets at the moment? The answer is no. I think that's as blunt as I can be. Can I pass down Tristan and Bruce? I don't know who's going to answer what else.
Yeah, sure. I'll have a stab at Etienne's question. I labeled it a mutually assured destruction approach. I mean, we share a planet together on the one hand, and climate change is unlike any other problem in that it's everybody's problem. And if nobody does anything, then nothing happens. But kind of in line with your thoughts, I think net zero for China, I think they've made 2060 and India's made 2070 as the net zero targets. Why do we have 2050 together with the rest of the developed world? I think that's a good part of your question. Someone mentioned steel and refineries shutting down. Remember, those processes are conventional processes as practiced in the rest of the world. And part of our message is things get old and die. It's kind of the cycle of life. We all like cheap things. And that's people develop new processes. They're more efficient. They're cheaper. We like buying things that get cheaper and cheaper. But unfortunately, the consequence of that is old things have to leave. And then the question is, well, if you don't like that, so you're shaking your head, what are you going to do about it? And who's going to pay for it? And so that's awkward. You mentioned the auto sector. It's kind of a pet hobby of mine, kind of opaque. There's tariffs on cars coming in. They get subsidies to build things. I don't think that's a neat example that fits in there. But I think ultimately we've been deindustrializing for a long time, and it's a globally connected world. If you're not productive, effective, efficient, have a plan and execute it on it, bad things are going to happen to you. So that's my comments on that. And I think I liked your thing about you only grow up when you realize you're going to die. I think the challenge here for me is, you know, Sasol and a lot of other companies had a near miss with COVID in 2020. Sasol share price went down to 20, well below what's called its net asset value. Cash was running out. You're running at a variable loss. And I think we can all agree COVID is a black swan event, and a huge black swan event. I think the challenge that we see is that as you get weaker and weaker, it's not just a black swan event that will take you out. It's other lesser events that also put you at risk. And then the timing becomes less and less predictable. So you don't know. So you say you only grow up when you realize you're going to die. In this case, you might die quite quickly before enough time to do something about it. So that's our warning, that if you look at commodity and the scale and the impact, it's a tough topic to talk about, but we need to start talking about this topic and think about what's going to do it. Maybe the answer is do nothing and invest somewhere else. Or you want to buttress and support, but it's a huge decision and it takes time. You can't have sort of what's happening in steel and refineries happen here. That's our view. And another part of the challenge is CEOs are 5 years. This is an awkward, uncomfortable topic to have a discussion about. This is a much longer time frame, but it takes a lot more time. So we're trying to create that awareness that we need to start talking about this.
Thank you. I'm going to answer one question and then make perhaps another remark about the stuff that's in our report. So, Mohammed, I really liked your question, but I wanted take it right back to a personal level first, and then expand it out into trying to answer your question. So on Sunday, I turned 65, and 65 is, I think, one of the official, one call it the official start of old age. Okay. I'm in the sunset phase of my life. And that poses a lot of questions. How many good years have I got left? And how do I age well? And I want to talk about aging well. Do the best to age well. That's what Sasol should be doing, thinking about how to age well. And that's really what we're suggesting, and that requires a candid conversation. So we come back to the personal. I wrote an email to my 2 boys and to my wife, and the headline of that email was, "In the event of my death." And I wrote a whole lot of things down, and then from time to time I go and review that. And then the topic of me dying is not a taboo topic with my boys, nor my wife. We sit down and discuss that. So that's perhaps an answer, Mohammed, is that Sasol, by its nature, and it's owned by its shareholders, does not want to discuss, and it's understandable. I mean, it's not even a criticism. That's not necessarily what shareholders want to hear in the event of my death. And so, but that's why potentially that conversation and that thinking cannot be led by Sasol on its own. The conversation about in the event of Secunda's death, that conversation needs to be had, and we need to think about who leads that conversation. And potentially it's not Sasol on its own. So that's just an observation. And then just one thing in our report which touches tangentially on Etienne's question, not really, is the issue of decarbonization. And we do have a bit of a philosophical discussion about that, and in terms of the Paris Agreement and decarbonization. And then also just an evidence-based perspective that there's a lot of forecasts about decarbonization, but decarbonization in practice has not happened. And the data, that's what the data shows. There's always a new forecast saying that not to worry, it hasn't happened yet, it will happen next year, or that, you know, but unfortunately the data, and I'm not making a moral value judgment, I'm just saying the data shows that we're just increasing emissions globally.
Mm-hmm.
And make of that what you will. All right, that's my contribution.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel so far. I would like to give Andile online just a chance to respond, and then we can see if we can take some online questions as well. Andile?
Thank you. I would just perhaps on the issue of colonialism and foreign loans. I mean, yeah, when this kind of climate financing began to rise, a lot of people called it green colonialism, or some people, such as ourselves, called it green structural adjustment. And, you know, we've held the position that what these loans often function to do is to justify the restructuring, marketization, or sometimes the privatization of public utilities, specifically within the energy, water, and transport industries, towards the benefit of a few rather than most. The World Bank and the IMF, I think, have been key players, and the European Union have been key players in advancing this restructuring agenda through the justification of debt. The idea that many developing nations simply don't have the fiscal space, and so they require our benevolent investments. I don't think it's so benevolent. And so it's also a question about sovereignty. If you want to be able to plan a just transition, you need economic and energy sovereignty. It's very difficult to have that when you have international finance institutions, telling your politicians what to do, essentially, to simplify it. I don't want to be reductive. The other issue also is that it's a question of democracy, I think, as well, when the just transition. Many of the agreements that the Treasury enters into, the foreign loan agreements for the just transition, do not undergo proper democratic scrutiny, oversight, and debate. And that you can lay that problem at the door of Parliament. Civil society and unions, COSATU and so on, and we comment and we raise submissions, but for the most part, parliamentarians have failed to advance proper oversight on the financial agreements of the just energy transition. And I think Sasol should avoid that kind of problem in the future. I will also agree with the last speaker about the decarbonization issue. That's quite true. The world is undergoing an energy expansion, not an energy transition, as one of our colleagues likes to say. And the reality is, that decarbonization is not nearly happening at the pace that it's required to happen in order to effectively curtail, if you can, at this point, the devastating impacts of climate change and ecological collapse. And I think there is a proper question about the responsibilities that the Global North has for being responsible for historic emissions. I individually am not one of the people who believes in climate reparations. I think politically that's very difficult to get. But I think there is a question of the need for Africa and developing countries in general to be able to set the just transition on their terms and not on the terms of countries in the global north that have been historically responsible for emissions. Because, for example, in Africa, 600 million people don't have electricity. So what are you transitioning towards to, really, if you want to have a just transition? I think the question of decarbonization is complicated depending on the context where it happens. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for those comments. A number of things I'd like to say as well, but I would like to actually just give our online, there are two hands, I think, being raised. So I'd like to just give them a chance to pose questions. And then I'm afraid to say that'll probably be it, and we'll move to close. But maybe I can just pass over to see if we can sort out the online questions being asked. Is that possible? Thanks, Gwen.
Yes,
hello.
It's Rodo speaking here. I'm an independent actor in the sustainability and just transition space. Thank you for this opportunity. I just wanted to ask a question about the ILO 2015 Just Transition Framework as to why South Africa has not ratified it, and wouldn't this hamper the just transition efforts in the country? Another question. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask the last question because in the interest of time. I wanted to know if the discussant discussed about the financial creativity or the innovation around financial aspects. I wanted to know whether Sasol can explore the Paris Agreement Article 6.4 mechanism of carbon credits, market mechanisms to decarbonize, ensure technology transfer, and also gain carbon credit and so forth. That is my last question.
Thank you. Okay, those have been noted. Thank you, Ronald. Can we take the next question?
Good day, everyone. My name is Juliana Setolia from the Free State. My question is, how can Sasol support inclusive participation in South Africa's emerging lithium-ion battery and energy storage value chains through partnerships with academia, SMMEs, and youth secular green economy initiatives, so that the just transition creates resource efficient and local industries and skills development opportunities for local communities?
Thank you for that question as well. Briefly, O'Connor, did you have as well? There's a third one. Okay, let's take that one quickly. Sorry. One more question online.
Thank you very much. Hero van Blotten's professor at the University of Cape Town. In the event of Secunda's death, would government be forced to put it on life support? Can Gauteng get enough fuel without Secunda being up and running?
Thank you. Okay, wonderful position to be in as the chairperson is I can throw you guys a hospital pass, right? That's allowed, yes? Okay.
Okay, just the one question we didn't answer properly from the first round. The lady asked about Commission of Inquiry into Sasol. In our document, we advocate planning. And my personal opinion is commissions of inquiry are not good at that. And we've had lots of them. But if you look at what's happened with the electricity crisis in this country, the ministries and departments responsible weren't doing their job. The presidency took it over and established NECOM, got the real players around the table and made some things happen. Not everything, municipal debt is still a big problem. So that, I think, is a better model for dealing with Secunda, is something along the NECOM lines. The problem will be getting the private sector involved, because if you look at the power relations in the private sector, Sasol is a big dog there. It's hard for the other players to tell Sasol what to do. I'm going to hospital pass, like you did, to my colleagues, the question about the ILO and Tristan to Article 6. You know, Harold's question about life support for Secunda. You know, if we looked at what happened with the steel industry, basically government passed the buck to the IDC and the Public Investment Corporation, which was pensioners' money, and got them to bail that out. Same was true with the chicken farm that went belly up as well. So if those are precedents, do those funds have the money to rescue Secunda? I don't know. Depends how much the pressure is. It will also depend how big the need is, and that's a function of the oil price. So it depends what the oil price is going to be when this, if this thing comes around, what it's going to be, last one, and how long will it take? Are we talking Band-Aid or are we talking replacing the capital equipment? Because those are two different things. Over to you, Nareen.
Thanks, Rod. I'm asked, and I'm being very strict about dealing with labor-related questions. Ronald asked the question, which is a highly technical question, about the International Labour Organization guidelines, okay, from 2015 on the just transition. So, I mean, I've deliberately put the word guidelines in there. So, yes, South Africa hasn't ratified them, but they debated. And for those of you who don't know, the ILO conference is actually sitting right now in Geneva. It used to sit for 3 weeks. It's sitting for 2 weeks now. And every year, you know, they have a different focus, and the just transition issues are starting to come up more and more and more. And why I give you that is that those things are established and set out by the ILO and by all the stakeholders around the world. And different countries have obligations to or decisions to ratify them or not. But remember that also those guidelines are seen as like the nice to have, the better, but the UN also has guidelines which are more the baseline, and we are obliged to follow those. So if South Africa decides to ratify them, that's actually even the better and the more better guidelines. But it doesn't mean we can't follow them, and it doesn't mean there's an obligation not to. And also that means we should put pressure on South Africa to actually align ourselves towards those in relation to that. So that's the answer in relation to that. And by the way, in our report, we very strongly advocate that they are very good guidelines and recommendations, and we suggest that we should use them to follow them because it gives everybody the responsibility to actually try and address them. Thanks. I'm now going to pass down, as Rod has suggested, to Tristan and Bruce to answer the rest of the questions. And Tristan's had his calculator out.
Uh-oh. What's the answer, Tristan?
Yeah, I think to the question from Cape Town, there is a massive pipeline that was built maybe 10 years ago with the NMPP from Durban to Johannesburg that was oversized by about 50% at the time, maybe with some foresight. But having said that, you need to recognize it's a value chain. So if you wanted to bring that fuel up, Durban Harbour is a huge problem. You need to build more tanks, you need to build intermediate pump stations, you need to build tanks at the end. I think we've seen from previous timelines on that, our message about a lot of time and planning is necessary would be well in order for that. I had my calculator out. I can't do mental maths so well anymore. In COVID time, the Sasol share price was 20. And I was working out that at that point in time, the total company value of Sasol was $1 billion. So Sasol, if government wanted to buy Sasol, was $1 billion in 2020, and it didn't, and was sort of mulling what does it actually mean in terms of support. I think the thing to note is the scale of this compared to steel and even the refineries one by one is just way, way, way larger. Yeah. We struggle trying to wrap our heads around what to do there. Once again, if you haven't got a plan and a thought process ready in advance, trying to deal with those things on the fly is going to be very difficult.
Thank you. I'm just going to talk briefly to Harrow's question about life support, and I think it's a very nice analogy. In the medical field, life support at end of life gets dealt with, I think, best by a thing called a living will. And there you explicitly think about, well, you know, how do we deal with life support? Sometimes life support is entirely justified. And you then think about when is it justified and when is it not? And certainly in end of life for people, sometimes life support gets severely abused. And you really look back and say, well, that was not appropriate. So this is exactly the discussion that needs to happen. And it doesn't matter how healthy you are and how strong you are. The discussion about a living will is always a good discussion, as uncomfortable as it may be. So to Harrow, I would say, I think the answer is we need the discussion about the living will.
Okay, thank you. Before I just hand over to Andile, there was another slightly technical question that was asked around the, I can rephrase it in a certain way, lithium-ion battery.
Oh, the lithium-ion battery.
And energy storage, yeah.
Okay, so maybe a somewhat flippant answer from me is that the question was posed in the sense of what should Sasol do? I think that none of us are I would say it's a really good question. Ask Sasol. Okay,
Well,
that was my...
I think the question was that, but it was also how could they support, should they choose to? Is there a possibility of them pivoting in any kind of a way?
Well, I do know that Sasol looks at all kinds of opportunities and, you know, and new business development. And so, I mean, Sasol does do that sort of thing. But again, and they're sometimes quite progressive in doing that sort of thing. But you know, if that person is interested in pursuing that, I think they should. Sasol might be open to that discussion.
Before we hand it down, I'm kind of, in the one hand, a capitalist at heart, and on the other hand, an environmentalist. I think my answer to that is, if you don't have sustainable competitive advantage, don't get into it. So in all of these things, doing it's not the right answer. You need to do it well. We're a globally connected world.
If you look at the big oil majors, BP, Shell, and so on, some years back, they got into electric power generation and to recharging points at their fuel service stations.
Mm-hmm.
In the Trump era, they're all reversing out of that quick. But that is a thing. I mean, if electric vehicles take off in this country, Sasol's going to be short of customers. And it does have a network of service stations. It could potentially get into electric vehicle charging, but that's a big business decision for them. They would have to take, you know, and with Tristan's comments in mind, I mean, we've seen, you know, mining companies in Scandinavia become world leaders in mobile telephones, cell phones. So stranger things have happened, but yeah, it's not easy to answer it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel as well. Andile, I'm just going to give you a last reply, and then we can move to closure.
Yeah, thanks to the panelists. I don't have much to say. I think they were able to cover those replies quite adequately. I would just say that, you know, the most important takeaway for me from the report is the necessity of planning, the necessity of progressive public investments, and the need for adopting plans that are going to be shaped in the needs and interests of workers and community, I would say, is the most vital aspect. But otherwise, thank you to everyone for the opportunity to input.
Thank you. I'd like to just give a last word of thanks as well to everyone who's made inputs. I think what's salient as well that hasn't maybe been mentioned enough for me, there were two things that stood out. One was the comment that there's no one in opposition to the just transition, which I think is a fair statement, but there are a number of parties that are in opposition to the just transition process, which is what the whole aspect is. Of course, we want a cleaner, less carbon, better life for everyone in the world. There are some people who challenge climate change, of course, but there are others who establish it as a real concern. The process that we are talking about in the labor movement is some are supportive of it and some aren't, and for valid reasons on both sides. If jobs are getting lost, why should unions support the just transition process? If there's no planning, why should they support it? If energy can be sourced through nuclear and other forms, and if we can continue to burn coal and have the North actually pay more for it, then why not? These are legitimate positions because it's got to do with protecting memberships in unions and protecting jobs in the country. But there are others who see it within the labor movement as there needs to be an actual transition, not just to cleaner jobs, but to better salaries, to better wages, to better kinds of life, and to better way of living in the country. Like the increase in public transport, which is a massive problem, which is not easily solvable either. And the last thing I'll say is the massive element of gender in all of these discussions needs to be brought out because, yes, there are a number of people at Sasol who work there who are going to be threatened by losing their jobs, and the communities and hundreds of thousands around them who will be threatened, but the most threatened in all of those aspects are women and children in general. And that's where the brunt of it is felt ordinarily. So a deep focus needs to be had on that. And what we aim to do as the Just Transition Labour Centre is take this evidence-based research and engage our steering committee, which is the four federations, engage communities we have networks with, and deal with what they can use that evidence for going forward. So we hope that that can be something we can bring together. And then lastly, I just want to thank the funders who fund us. We have AFD, we have Climate Works, and we have African Climate Foundation. So they've been able to fund this research and the centre to address. And I would like to also thank the four federations that are on our steering committee that help provide this research as what we need to be focusing on, and we'll be sitting with them when the report is actually released and hopefully taken up in a variety of places like NEDLAC, like collective bargaining fora, and also engagement with communities. So I'd like to thank them, and also lastly for the TIPS staff who's helped us manage this whole Friday development dialogue oddity, and we're very happy to have you all here. Thanks to everyone who participated online and joining in. Like I said, we'll circulate the slides. The report will be hopefully circulated on the website next week, but you can currently find the previous report and a variety of other research that links to this. And thanks for my staff as well at the JTLC for assisting us in bringing this all together. With that, I'll bring it to a close, but for those who are here, we have some eats at the back, so please help yourself, and thank you for coming as well. Thank you, everyone.